My best years are behind me, Ephraim Calder said, his voice carrying the weathered grit of 6 decades spent fighting the quiet erosion of time. Louisa Pembroke let the silence settle between them for a long moment, the cool autumn air stirring the frayed hem of her dress before she gently placed her hand over his on the porch rail. The sun was dipping beneath the jagged ridge of the Colorado mountains, painting the western sky in bruised shades of violet and lingering gold. "Then let us make the years ahead worth remembering," she replied softly, her touch steady and unhurried. At 64, Ephraim had nearly forgotten how terrifying the sudden arrival of hope could feel, how it could slip beneath a man's defenses and shake the foundation of a life built entirely on quiet endurance. 3 months earlier, he barely knew her name, viewing the world as a place where all significant events had already transpired. He was a widower who had slowly come to accept the bitter notion that his remaining time was merely a matter of waiting out the clock. His 3 children had long since grown, married and scattered to distant towns, making visits rare occasions that required weeks of deliberate planning rather than a simple ride down the road. His beloved wife Beatrice had been gone for 8 long years, and he had remained alone on the modest ranch where they had raised their family, going through the motions of routine. He spent his days mending broken fences, driving cattle through the dry brush, and preparing solitary meals that never quite tasted like anything worth sitting down to enjoy. He found himself talking more to his old workhorse than to any human soul in a given week, retreating deeper into the silence of the valley. Whenever business forced him into town, he left the moment his errands were completed, slipping away before anyone could invite him to linger for conversation he no longer knew how to navigate. The world had moved on, and he was content to let it pass him by, safe within the familiar walls of his own isolation. But that very autumn, a widow named Louisa Pembroke arrived in the valley to settle near her married daughter Nell, who was expecting her 2nd child before the heavy winter frosts set in. At 60, Louisa was practical, sharp-witted, and utterly determined not to become an unwanted burden on a young family already managing a household of their own. She deliberately rented a small, drafty cottage at the very edge of town, instead of moving into Nell's crowded home, taking a part-time job behind the counter at the local mercantile simply to keep her mind and hands occupied. She was no stranger to the weight of solitude, having lost her husband Silas 6 years prior, spending the intervening time caring for relatives until she realized she no longer knew what to do with a day that belonged solely to her. Their paths crossed properly on a crisp morning during a community gathering meant to repair the leaking roof of the valley's small wooden church. Half the township had turned out for the effort, with men scaling high ladders and straddling exposed rafters, while the women organized large tables below, keeping heavy pots of black coffee and warm bread moving constantly. Ephraim had instinctively chosen to work alone on the far north edge of the roof, hammering shingles with deliberate rhythmic strikes that kept the rest of the world at a safe distance. It was Louisa, carrying a heavy tin plate covered with a cloth, who noticed from below that he had not paused to eat or rest since the labor began at daybreak. She caught the subtle, deliberate way he kept his back turned to the crowded yard below, working with an intensity designed specifically to discourage anyone from approaching him or offering idle conversation. Without hesitation, she climbed the short wooden ladder until her head cleared the eaves, holding out the warm plate toward him with a look of quiet expectation. "You've forgotten to eat your midday meal, Mr. Calder," she said, her voice clear above the sound of hammering. Ephraim paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, staring at the plate with deep suspicion before shaking his head. "Didn't ask for tending to," he muttered, refusing to reach for the offering. "Offering a hard-working man a plate of food isn't tending to him," Louisa replied without flinching, her gaze steady. "It is simply common manners, so you needn't flatter yourself into thinking it's anything more complicated than that." Realizing she had no intention of climbing down until he accepted, Ephraim took the plate, mostly to give his broad, calloused hands something to hold. "Much obliged to you all the same," he offered quietly, glancing down at the sliced ham and fresh bread. Louisa lingered at the top rung of the ladder a moment longer than the task required, watching him inspect the timber beneath his boots with excessive seriousness. "You have driven nails into that exact same cedar shingle 3 separate times now, Mr. Calder," she observed with a dry, knowing amusement that caught him completely off guard. Ephraim looked down, realizing with a sudden rush of warmth in his neck that she was entirely correct about the overworked board. Wanted to make sure it was secure against the winter winds, he offered lamely, searching for a defense. Louisa let out a small, quiet sound that suggested she didn't believe a word of his explanation, then carefully descended the ladder to return to the bustling tables. For the first time in more years than he cared to count, Ephraim found himself working the remainder of the long afternoon with the faint trace of a genuine smile on his face. The following Wednesday, Ephraim made his customary trip into the mercantile to purchase his basic provisions for the coming month, a sack of flour, coffee beans, and a sturdy coil of hemp rope. Upon stepping up to the wooden counter, he found a thick slice of homemade bread and a freshly poured cup of hot coffee set neatly beside the ledger, as if waiting specifically for his arrival. He was later than usual that day, having been delayed by a stubborn fence post that needed to be reset before the deep frost locked the ground solid. Louisa had nearly given the baked goods to another customer twice over during the long afternoon, convincing herself each time that she had no logical reason to save them for a man who rarely spoke. Yet she had held them back anyway, sliding the wooden plate toward him the moment he approached the register with an expression of pure indifference. "The storekeeper was going to let this go stale," she remarked casually, wiping down the polished counter with a dry rag. "I dislike seeing good food wasted when there's someone around who can put it to proper use." Ephraim stared at the fresh, warm bread, which showed not the slightest sign of being stale, before raising his eyes to meet hers. "That is very kind of you, Mrs. Pembroke," he said, his voice low and somewhat unpracticed in the art of unexpected gratitude. "It is purely practical," Louisa replied briskly, adjusting her apron strings. He paid for his flour and rope, but instead of turning on his heel and heading straight for his wagon as he had done for 8 straight years, he lingered at the counter. "You have an unusually sharp memory for a man's routine order," he said, leaning slightly against the shelf. "I have a sharp memory for most things," Louisa countered softly. "It happens to be one of the few faculties that old age hasn't managed to strip away from me quite yet." As Ephraim made the long ride back to his empty ranch that evening, the heavy silence of the valley felt somewhat less oppressive than usual. He was forced to admit to himself that a simple errand for rope and flour had left him in remarkably better spirits than it ever had before. By the time the next month rolled around, the two of them found themselves sitting together in the same church pew every Sunday morning. Neither of them would ever have openly admitted to the rest of the congregation that they had both begun arriving 20 minutes earlier than necessary for that precise purpose. "You are exceptionally early again today, Mr. Calder," Louisa whispered one morning as he took his seat beside her. "So are you," Ephraim replied, settling his heavy frame onto the smooth bench. "I prefer a good view of the sermon," she noted, to which he simply agreed, neither of them ever suggesting they sit anywhere else. A severe flare-up in Ephraim's lower back left him barely able to walk the following week, restricting his movements to the bare minimum required to keep his livestock fed and watered. Unannounced and entirely uninvited, Louisa arrived at his lonely ranch late one Tuesday evening in the back of a borrowed farm wagon, carrying a heavy iron pot filled with warm stew. When she pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the dim entryway, the absolute stillness of the house struck her immediately. It was quiet in the distinct heavy way of a home built to hold a noisy family, but inhabited by a solitary man who had stopped truly living within its walls long ago. As she set the heavy pot down on the cold cast-iron stove, her eyes drifted to the wooden shelf overhead, where 2 matching clay plates were set out side by side. One plate was worn and clean from daily use, while the other sat covered in a thin layer of grey dust, untouched for nearly a decade. "Sit yourself down in that chair," she commanded firmly, before Ephraim could even begin to formulate a polite protest about her unexpected presence. "You are going to eat a proper hot meal tonight for once, whether you think you deserve it or not." Ephraim sat down slowly at the long oak table, driven more by sheer astonishment than obedience, watching her ladle the steaming stew into both dishes. She placed the second plate directly across from him, the first time that dish had seen food served upon it since the day Beatrice was laid to rest in the high meadow. Louisa then walked over to inspect a small pan on the stove, lifting the lid to find his half-cooked, abandoned attempt at dinner before making a face of deep disapproval. "Are these plain salt beans yet again?" she asked, turning to face him with her hands resting squarely on her hips. "Beans are a reliable, sturdy dish for a man living alone," Ephraim offered defensively, shifting uncomfortably under her sharp gaze. It appears to be the only dish you possess, Louisa retorted, shaking her head. I took the liberty of looking inside your pantry cabinet, Mr. Calder, and there is not a single item in this entire house that isn't dried beans, dark coffee, or something waiting to be boiled into beans. Ephraim let out a sudden, deep laugh, a genuine booming sound that surprised even himself, echoing off the wooden rafters of a kitchen that had not heard such noise in longer than he cared to remember. When he attempted to return the clean iron pot to her house in town the next evening, she refused to accept it at the door. I will take that pot back only when you have learned to cook something inside this house that doesn't involve a dry bean, she said with a sharp twinkle in her eye before closing the door. During one of her frequent visits to the ranch later that crisp autumn, Louisa noticed an old broken wooden chair shoved deep into the dark corner of the front sitting room. One of its carved legs was splintered near the base, and a spindle was missing entirely, leaving it slumped uselessly against the wall covered in cobwebs. It had clearly been sitting in that exact spot for years, yet it was equally obvious that Ephraim had intentionally refused to throw it out or haul it to the woodpile. "Why do you keep a broken chair in your main room if you cannot sit in it?" she asked one afternoon, stopping to inspect the weathered wood. Ephraim paused in his work, staring down at the floorboards for a long, uncomfortable moment before answering. "Just never got around to fixing the thing," he said quietly, a phrase that both of them understood was neither the full truth nor an outright lie. 2 visits later, while searching for a spare lantern, Louisa discovered the missing wooden spindle hidden behind the pantry door, right where it had been set down and forgotten years ago. "This chair is certainly not beyond saving if a person is willing to put a little effort into it," she declared, hauling the broken piece into the center of the room. "I said the exact same thing about the church roof," Ephraim remarked dryly, "and that required a full day and half the men in the valley." "Then we had best get to work right now," Louisa replied without hesitation, fetching a small pot of wood glue and a crate of tools from the porch. By the time the sun began to drop behind the timberline, the old chair stood upright beside the kitchen table once more, somewhat uneven and still in dire need of fresh varnish, but completely sturdy and functional. Ephraim did not voice what that broken chair had represented while sitting abandoned in the dark corner for nearly 8 years, nor did he explain the heavy memory tied to its split wood. He didn't need to explain it. Louisa understood the language of lingering grief well enough on her own, having carried her own silent burdens across many long winters. They gradually fell into an easy, unhurried habit of speaking about the spouses they had lost, bringing up their names not as taboo subjects to be avoided, but naturally as old friends are mentioned in long conversations. "Beatrice used to hum whenever she was deeply angry with me," Ephraim shared one evening as they sat on the front porch, shelling a large basket of fresh peas. "Most people hum when they are feeling cheerful," Louisa noted with a soft chuckle. "Not Beatrice," Ephraim said with a wistful smile. "The brighter and livelier the tune she sang, the deeper the trouble I was in, and I learned to dread her singing far more than any raised voice." Louisa smiled warmly at the memory, leaning back against the wooden siding of the house. "Silas was a good man, but he got hopelessly lost every single time he insisted he knew the shortcut," she recalled. "I learned early in our marriage to pack twice as much food as any trip required, because I knew we would be eating dinner miles off the intended road." "Sounds like he was a fine man to travel with," Ephraim offered softly. "He was," Louisa agreed quietly, looking out over the quiet pastures. "He was wrong about almost every road we ever took, but he was remarkably right about nearly everything else that mattered in life." Neither of them felt a trace of jealousy or bitterness when the other spoke of the past, understanding instinctively that speaking a beloved name aloud was not an attempt to pull the dead back into the present. It was simply a way of honoring the life they had already built, while gently clearing enough space at the table for whatever comfort might come next. Yet it was Ephraim who unexpectedly asked the one question that proved most difficult for Louisa to answer. "What would you actually do?" he asked late one afternoon, "if you were given a whole day that belonged entirely to you? No daughter needing assistance, no grandchild to watch, and no store counter to tend." Louisa grew remarkably quiet, staring out at the dusty yard for so long that Ephraim began to think she had decided to ignore the question entirely. "I don't rightly know," she admitted finally, her voice unusually soft. "I have spent so many decades arranging every hour of my life around what somebody else required of me that I am not entirely sure I remember how to want something for myself alone." "Well," Ephraim said gently, reaching over to adjust the strap on his boot, "you have plenty of time to figure it out, and nobody is demanding an answer from you today." She pondered his question for several days afterward, carrying it with her through her chores, until she returned to the ranch with a simple answer. "Flowers," she said abruptly as she stepped onto the porch. "I always intended to plant sweet-smelling flowers along the front rail of every house I ever lived in, but there was always a pressing chore that forced it to wait until later." Ephraim looked at the bare, unadorned wooden rail of his porch for a long, contemplative moment before looking up at her. "Well, Mrs. Pembroke," he said quietly, "it appears that later has finally arrived for both of us." It was on that very porch a few weeks later, as they sat watching the shadows lengthen across the valley floor, that Ephraim voiced the thought he had been suppressing. "I cannot for the life of me understand why a capable woman like you would waste her precious time on a stubborn, set-in-his-ways old man like me," he confessed, staring down at his weathered hands. "My absolute best years are far behind me." Louisa remained silent for a few heartbeats, then reached out and placed her warm hand over his on the cool railing. "Then let us make the years ahead worth remembering," she whispered softly, her words settling deep into his chest. That single sentence haunted Ephraim for days, echoing in his mind while he repaired cattle fences, fed the horses, and sat alone in the evening light. He looked across the kitchen table at the mended wooden chair standing proudly in the light, no longer an abandoned wreck forgotten in the dark corner of the house. He slowly came to the painful realization that he had spent nearly a decade so utterly consumed by honoring the past that he had quietly surrendered his right to live in the present. He had allowed himself to become a ghost in his own home, mistaking isolation for loyalty to a life that had ended. Just as he felt the heavy walls of his old routine beginning to crumble, a letter arrived at the local post office that would threaten to tear down the fragile understanding he and Louisa had built together. Word of the developing closeness between the widowed rancher and the town's new clerk reached Tobias Calder by way of a cousin's casual letter sent down to Pueblo. The letter mentioned in passing that Ephraim had been seen keeping regular, intentional company with a widow from town, sitting together at church and lingering long after services concluded. Tobias was Ephraim's eldest son, a stern, practical man who had left the hard ranching life behind the moment he was old enough to make his own way in the city. The news troubled him in a way he could not immediately articulate, sparking an urgent need to inspect the situation firsthand. He arrived by passenger train and hired wagon just 9 days after reading the letter, traveling far sooner than his sisters could manage from their distant homes back east, and considerably sooner than the situation strictly warranted. He stepped into the old timber house with heavy boots, setting his travel bag down hard on the wooden floorboards of the front room. He bypassed the usual pleasantries, looking his father in the eye with an expression of sharp suspicion. "Father," Tobias began without delay, "I want to know exactly what is going on between you and this Mrs. Pembroke." Ephraim stood by the stove, taking a deep breath to steady his voice before answering his son. "We keep each other company, Tobias," he replied quietly. "It is nothing more complicated or sinister than two people finding comfort in a conversation." Tobias let out a cold, disbelieving laugh, pacing the length of the room with his hands resting on his hips. "Do you truly think I am blind to what this looks like from the outside?" Tobias asked, his voice rising in anger. "Mother has been buried in the upper meadow for 8 years, and now an unfamiliar woman appears out of nowhere, wanting your afternoons, your porch, and a place at your dinner table. I intend to find out what she is really after out here, because this land and this ranch represent a lifetime of hard labor." Ephraim's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening as a rare flash of anger crossed his weathered face. "She is after nothing but honest company, Tobias," Ephraim stated, his voice sharper and louder than he had intended. "She wants the exact same thing I want, and I will not have you questioning her motives in my house." The visit ended in a cold, brittle silence, leaving a wide gulf of resentment between father and son that neither knew how to bridge. 2 days later, Nell cornered her brother at the mercantile counter in town, where Louisa happened to be quietly stocking dry goods just out of direct sight down the aisle. Nell was a sensible woman who had watched her mother work tirelessly for others her entire life, and she had no patience for her brother's sudden outburst. You aren't truly afraid she's trying to steal the land, Tobias, Nell said directly, setting her coffee cup down on the wooden counter with a sharp rap. You have never cared about this ranch, and you left it for Pueblo the very first chance you got as a young man. Tobias stood quiet for a long moment, staring down at his broad, calloused hands as the defense drained out of him. I told myself it was about the property, Tobias admitted softly, his voice dropping so low that Louisa barely caught the words through the wooden shelving. The land is simply an easier thing to be angry about than facing the memory of Mother. I suppose I was terrified that if this old house changes, if someone new sits in her chair and cooks in her kitchen, Mother will disappear from our lives a little more every day. I left home young, Nell, and I wasn't here for those 8 long years Father spent completely alone in the quiet. Seeing him laugh with a stranger feels as though I missed my only chance to be the one who helped him heal. Louisa said nothing from her place behind the shelf, holding her breath to avoid revealing that she had overheard the vulnerable confession. She set a heavy wooden crate down on the floor a little more gently than the task required, carrying the weight of his words with her during the long, reflective wagon ride back to her small cottage at the edge of town. The gossip surrounding Tobias's unexpected visit spread through the small valley within days, as local news always did in close-knit rural communities. Louisa felt the heavy, suffocating weight of that talk far more keenly than she allowed anyone in town to see. She had spent an entire lifetime making certain she was never the source of friction or discomfort for anyone else. It was an ingrained habit, this instinctive urge to step backward into the shadows long before anyone could explicitly request her departure. She had yielded her own wishes for her mother, for her sisters, and for every household she had ever managed for someone else's convenience. The moment she sensed trouble brewing between Ephraim and his son, her long-practiced instinct took over, dictating her choices. She abruptly stopped making her regular trips out to the ranch, inventing minor chores in town to explain her sudden absence. When Sunday morning arrived, she deliberately delayed her departure, allowing the customary seat in the 5th pew to be taken by other congregants before she slipped into a dark bench near the back doors. She even mentioned to her daughter Nell during a quiet afternoon tea that it might be wise to look for a small rental house in the next town over, somewhere her presence would not complicate an established family's grief. Nell listened to her mother's soft rationale with growing frustration, finally putting her teacup down with a sharp clatter. You do this every single time, Mama, Nell said firmly, looking her mother squarely in the eyes. The very moment someone else experiences the smallest amount of discomfort, you erase yourself so completely that people forget you were ever inconvenienced in the first place. You did it for Papa's family for decades, and you have done it for me more times than I can count. When does this self-sacrifice stop being a virtue and start being a cowardly habit you use to avoid asking for what you actually want out of life? Louisa sat in complete silence, having no quick or easy answer for her daughter's sharp observation, feeling the truth of it settle uncomfortably in her chest. For his part, Ephraim initially accepted the sudden, cold distance between them in quiet resignation. He told himself that his son Tobias was probably right, that a man of 64 had no business disrupting his children's peace of mind over a late-life companion. But as the days turned into a full week of absolute silence on the ranch, the heavy emptiness of the house pressed in on him harder than it ever had before. Every single evening, he sat alone at the kitchen table, looking across the polished wood at the freshly mended chair, standing empty in the dim light. He stared at that chair for hours, until an undeniable truth settled deep within his spirit, banishing the faint doubts that had plagued him. The silence that had filled his home for 8 years had never been a noble act of loyalty to his late wife, Beatrice. It had merely been deep, suffocating loneliness, wearing the respectable coat of grief, and he had allowed himself to wear that coat comfortably simply because it was familiar. Realizing his mistake, Ephraim pulled out a pen and paper that very night to write letters to his 2 younger children living farther away. He did not write to demand their approval or to beg for their permission, but to state plainly what had occurred in his life and what he hoped the future might hold. For the first time in his life, he was not seeking their validation, but offering them honest transparency as an equal. It took nearly a month for the reply letters to return and for travel arrangements to be coordinated across the state. His younger daughter arrived first by passenger train from Denver, driven far more by gentle curiosity about her father's new life than by any real concern. His youngest son wrote a short, practical note stating that he trusted his father's personal judgment implicitly and saw no reason to create drama from 400 miles away. Tobias was the last member of the family to return to the ranch, his pride keeping him guarded until a quiet moment altered his perspective. He walked into the ranch house unannounced one afternoon, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw Louisa standing near the stone fireplace. She was carefully dusting the silver frame of a photograph sitting on the mantel, a portrait of a young Beatrice laughing at something outside the frame. "You could have taken that photograph down by now," Tobias said, his voice cautious and testing as he stood near the doorway. "Most women who come into a widower's house would have hidden it in a drawer weeks ago." Louisa paused, turning around to look at him with a look of genuine puzzle on her face. "Why on earth would I ever do something so foolish and cruel, Tobias?" she asked softly. "This woman raised the man I have come to care for, and she built the foundation of this very home. I would much rather clean her portrait with respect than pretend she never existed in these rooms." She carefully placed the frame back in its exact position on the mantelpiece, turning to face him fully. "I am not here to erase anyone's memory, Tobias. I'm only here because your father and I would both prefer to spend our remaining years a little less lonely than we have been." Tobias stared at the photograph on the mantel, then looked back at Louisa for a long, silent moment as the last of his resentment dissolved. "Louisa," he said softly, using her given name for the very first time instead of the cold, formal title he had used like a wall between them. It was a simple shift in speech, but it was more than enough to signify that the battle had ended. Not long after, the entire valley gathered at the large community barn for the annual celebration marking the end of the heavy autumn harvest. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fresh pies, while a local fiddler played lively tunes beneath lanterns strung high across the rafters. Louisa felt self-conscious among the crowd and was preparing to slip away early, still uncertain of her place, when Ephraim crossed the floor and held out his hand to her. "I haven't danced a step in nearly 10 years, he admitted with a nervous smile, "and I fully expect to step on your toes more than once tonight." Louisa smiled, taking his hand without hesitation. "At our age, Ephraim, nobody expects us to dance quickly anyway." In full view of their neighbors, children and grandchildren, the two of them began to move together across the wooden floor in a slow, comfortable rhythm. Tobias stood near the food tables with his arms crossed over his chest, watching them with a calm, accepting expression. When the song finally came to an end, Tobias was the very first person to cross the barn floor, offering his father a firm nod that communicated far more than any spoken words could express. Ephraim held fast to Louisa's hand long after the music died down, and neither of them showed any inclination to let go as the valley celebrated around them. A few months later, as the winter frost began to yield to the soft breath of early spring, Ephraim asked Louisa to marry him. They were standing on the very porch rail, where he had once mournfully declared that his best years were long behind him. The small wooden boxes he had built and mounted along the balustrade at his own insistence were already filled with dark, rich soil, waiting for the seeds they would plant together. Louisa looked at him with a quiet, searching gaze, asking him plainly whether he was proposing out of genuine love or simply out of a lingering fear of the solitude returning to his home. "I was terribly lonely before you walked into my life," Ephraim admitted, his voice steady as he held her hands in his. "But pure loneliness is not why I'm asking you to share my life today. I am asking because every ordinary small detail of my daily routine is made immeasurably better the moment I know I get to share it with you. The morning coffee, the change in the weather, the broken fence that needs mending, none of it feels like a burden anymore. I do not want you here to fill an empty silence, Louisa. I want you here because the years ahead are simply better with you living them alongside me." Louisa listened to his words, a soft warmth filling her eyes, before she offered her acceptance on one very specific condition. "You will have to learn to cook a proper supper yourself," she said with a teasing smile, "at least one night out of every week." Ephraim let out a rich laugh that echoed across the yard, readily agreeing to her terms without a moment's hesitation. Neither of them made explicit mention of the burnt pot of salt beans from that cold October evening, though the memory lived fondly in both their minds as the moment their quiet lives had begun to shift. Their wedding took place a few weeks later in the small wooden church at the center of the valley, the very building whose leaking roof Ephraim had once repaired high on a ladder without any expectation of changing his solitary existence. Tobias stood proudly beside his father as his best man, while Nell walked her mother down the short aisle toward the altar. Neither Beatrice's memory nor Silas's presence was erased or ignored on that joyous day. Both names were spoken aloud with deep affection during the service, without a single trace of the old fear that honoring a past love would somehow diminish the quiet strength of a new one. The first evening, Ephraim attempted to fulfill his promise to cook dinner. He managed to burn half the pot of stewed beans anyway, filling the old timber kitchen with thick smoke. Louisa was forced to throw open the high glass windows while laughing so hard she could barely breathe, as their young grandchildren shrieked with pure delight while playing tag in the yard outside. By the time the following spring arrived in full, the quiet ranch no longer carried the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a museum dedicated to past grief. Children's laughter echoed through the open doors every Sunday afternoon, and Ephraim's grown offspring gathered around the long dining table far more often than they had in a decade, drawn as much by Louisa's warm hospitality as by the remarkable transformation in their father's spirit. Bright, fragrant flowers bloomed along the length of the front porch rail, planted directly alongside an old hardy rosebush that had been carefully tended by Beatrice decades ago. Nothing original had been torn out or destroyed to make room for the new growth. Space had simply been expanded to allow new life to flourish alongside the sturdy roots of what had come before. Ephraim stood beside Louisa on the front porch early one morning, watching the soft golden light of dawn catch the fresh blossoms along the rail. He looked out over the quiet valley and finally voiced the deep truth he had come to understand. He had been entirely wrong on that autumn evening months ago. His best years had not been buried in the past at all. Some of them had simply required a little more time, patience, and courage to finally begin. For the first time in nearly a decade, both wooden chairs at the kitchen table were regularly occupied by people who shared their lives, their memories, and their hopes, and neither of them was in any hurry to walk away from the table. Ephraim had started at 64, believing his story was effectively over, while Louisa had arrived in the valley convinced her remaining days were meant to be spent quietly out of everyone's way. What they discovered in each other was not a weak replacement for what time had taken from them, but living proof that deep grief and profound love can share the exact same space without crowding each other out.